or we usually move those out. And these are things that can only be, they're reserved for appropriation, only can be at a town meeting vote. And the last thing we have is just other revenue and donations. These are things people want to donate to. I have to set up a special account if somebody's donating to for land maintenance or for things like that. Anything, for any purpose that's a donation account, we have to have them each account set up specifically for those donations, and that's how they can use the revenue. And we have the same thing with the ATF, that's a donation account, transportation, student activities, and things like that. So just quickly, really, there's not a lot to report because we're only really into the early stage of the fiscal year, but I will continue to monitoring that.
Okay, thank you, Darlene. Our next item on the agenda this evening is a presentation by Dr. Denise Pigeon from Neshoba Valley Technical Schools on the budget development process and capital needs.
Thank you, and I just want to say thank you for the invitation to come here this evening. I know I share this with you each year, but this really is a great kickoff meeting, and I appreciate how informative, helpful, and collaborative the meeting has been over the years. I always like to start by just grounding us in a little bit about our mission and membership. As you know, we are your regional vocational technical school partner. We have 8 member towns, and we basically work together to be able to provide a variety of technical training programs to the students in our region. In terms of our offerings, they have not changed since last year. We have the same offerings. The same trends are also still true as they were last year. Construction continues to be booming, with 47% of our students enrolled in either a construction or transportation program. About 30% of our students in health and services, and 22% in arts and technology. In terms of our preliminary district enrollment, I just have to say Paul is amazing at being able to look at our enrollment and start to make projections. We converse when October 1 comes around, and I'm always amazed by how quickly he can run the numbers of percentages of our enrollment. So enrollment continues to be strong at Neshoba Tech. Our 10-year enrollment trends, you can see, fairly stable over the last couple of years. 769 district students, which is up by 5 from last year. We currently do not have space for postgraduates, and with ongoing application trends, I don't foresee that would be changing moving into the next year. In terms of how that works itself out by town, again, some of our towns have increasing enrollment, other towns have slightly decreasing enrollment. For the town of Chelmsford, it looks like the town will be up by 6 students overall. Chelmsford continues to be the largest member sending district. Followed second by Pepperell, again, a trend that is pretty stable from year over year. The enrollment change for Chelmsford is up slightly, percentage is up just a little bit. It's at 28.09%, up from last year at 27.49%. In terms of, as we're planning our budget considerations, our contracts for our teachers are settled through June of '27. Our paraprofessionals, professional support staff, custodians, and CAF are settled through June of '28. Our transportation, we're looking at potentially exercising an extension year in that contract, and we will be having to go out to bid for HVAC support contracts. So we're in the preliminary phases of working through those items for our budget planning for next year. I'm sure we'll hear more about this in the coming slides, but we're all looking carefully at the uncertainty with state and federal funds as we move forward in this budget year. And we're all looking forward towards how we're going to manage student needs and related staffing and support needs in the current climate. Health insurance increases are a concern in a lot of places. We're watching this closely. And for Neshoba Tech, capital expenses is something that we are also watching very closely and carefully. Capital projects that are underway. It has been a wonderful kickoff to our school year. Cosmetology renovation, and I had to put it in italics, is finally complete. This was a very long project, but it is done, and I thank the members who are here today that were able to come to our ribbon cutting and celebrate with our students. It really was wonderful. Our vet assisting and electrical expansion is in its final stages. Hope to complete in the next couple of months. That was a state grant funded project. We did complete the Phase 3 of our fire suppression system upgrades, and we're currently gearing up to go out to bid for Phase 4. As you may recall, several years ago, I was sharing with this group that we have to do a full renovation of our entire building, which is a very large facility. We've broken it up into stages to manage the cost and manage the project, so that continues. And we've also just recently had an opportunity to repaint all of our hallways, so the students are really loving that. Thinking ahead for capital, we continue to have a lot of high needs for our building. As you know, it was built in the 60s, but we have done a great job managing it over the years. We do need to finish the fire suppression project. We also have some other large capital items that we had deferred last year, which was the replacement of several of our minibuses for our fleet. We have some exterior doors that need attention. One section of our roof needs to be replaced, and our boilers are at the end of their useful life. We also have some parking lot and curbing repairs that we need to address, and HVAC in general. I know that for the last couple of years, you've been hearing me talk about HVAC and how are we going to tackle this big project. I'm happy to share that we did find out just a couple of weeks ago that we have been invited into the schematic design phase for a potential HVAC project to convert to heat pumps. So we just received this notification. I personally am happy that the timing of this is as we had hoped. So as you may recall, we have a very large piece of debt from our major project in 2004-2005 that will be coming off the books. Looking to potentially time this very large project with that changeover in the debt. So again, our goal, and this is what we've been discussing at our committee level meetings, is to try to keep that assessment as level as possible between the debt and capital expenses. So more to come on that in the coming months. In terms of anticipated and future savings, as you know, we continue to be very aggressive with our competitive grant applications. On October 10th, we were notified of an additional grant award from the state, just about $399,000 for carpentry and ECC. What's nice about this grant is that one of the pieces of equipment that we'll be able to replace is the dust collection system for our carpentry program, which is an enormous piece of equipment and a very expensive piece of equipment that's been carried on our capital plan that we'll be able to address through this grant. So we're very happy about that. Just last week, or actually about a week and a half ago at this point, we submitted another very large grant application with the hopes that if awarded this grant, we would have the ability to move forward with adding 2 additional technical programs that are in high need and high demand, and that is an HVAC program and a property maintenance, facility maintenance program. So we're hoping, and we should know hopefully in January if that's something that might happen for Neshoba Tech. And that was a $5 million grant application. We also continue to partner in-house with our technical programs to keep the capital moving. They do a great job for us, and we couldn't do it without them. In terms of the budget, we have kicked off our budget season. Our budget message has gone out. Our staff are already actively filling out their budget workbooks. We'll be collecting those for the next couple of weeks and going through internal review in November and December, finalizing at the committee level in December into early January. Hosting our budget breakfast likely the last week of January, first week of February, timed around the release of the governor's numbers. And we're anticipating our public hearing this year will be on Tuesday, February 10th, which, as you know, we have to provide this process 45 days in advance of our first town meeting. And we're anticipating that meeting would be in Westford on March 28th. So a lot of exciting things happening at Neshoba Tech. I thank you for your support and happy to answer any questions you may have.
Denise, would those programs, the HVAC, really require an addition to the school or an expansion, similar to what was?
Great question. So if the big idea goes through, we are looking to actually renovate a space in our building that was the old diesel shop that's currently right now used as facilities. We house things in there for facilities. So we would renovate that to become HVAC. And then we're looking to potentially rebuild. We have an old building on the property that could use a tear down and rebuild. So we would use the same footprint, but replace that building to possibly house facility management. So not really an expansion of footprint, just a renovation and expansion of usable instructional space.
And you said that would get granted in January.
Mm-hmm.
If that did occur, would those programs be offered to students in '28 or when?
Yeah, it would be about probably a 1.5 to a 2-year process to get them off the ground.
Okay. And the final question, just thoughts that you're presenting. Your building was built in the 60s. In this area, is that one of the oldest technical schools in terms of, because I know Monty Tech's been, I'm sorry, Minuteman's been reconstructed. I know there's plans to build the one in the Haverhill and so forth. Is you're sort of up there in terms of?
We are in the same bracket in terms of age, but what I will say, I can't take credit for this, it was long before I came, but that major renovation that was done between 2003 and 2005 was a complete and total like gut renovation, which is what I think has made the building last as long as it has, and we've continued to keep it up to the best of our ability. So we are not in a place where we're looking for a new building, but we do have some pieces of our building that need some major renovation, and that is that HVAC project, which is something we've been talking a lot about for several years. The full HVAC project is pretty extensive in the size of our building. That's why this accelerated repair project is something we're so excited about potentially partnering. So again, what we're hoping is that as in the next year, we'll have to complete the fire suppression project, so our capital expenses will go up, but our debt will be going down. And then next year, if the new debt is coming on, the new debt would come on and the capital would be going down so that we can continue to balance that out. So I think that we've been addressing it proactively. And with these additional grants, we have gone from program to program to program, renovating inside out. So I think we're going to keep going for quite some time.
Any other questions or comments for Dr. Pigeon? Seeing none, we'll move on to our next agenda item, and that is a presentation by our school superintendent, Dr. Jay Lane, updating on the budgetary status for the current fiscal year and outlook for FY '27.
Thanks, Pat, and welcome everyone tonight. As we typically do, just going to run through current fiscal '26 budget, the year that we're in now. Fortunately, last spring, we actually settled all of our collective bargaining agreements with our unions that had contracts that were up June 30th. So that actually helped us as far as setting the current budget and certainly helps us with the outlook for the future years. The only group that is is already out of cycle is our building custodians. We have 9 building custodians, so it's a very small unit that happen to have their contract up this June 30th. So after the first of the year, I'm sure we'll begin negotiating with them. But all of the other major employee unions are settled, so that was certainly helpful for the current year and also helps us when we do our projections for fiscal '27. All of our fiscal '26 accounts, both our personnel and non-personnel accounts, are in good shape. We have no concerns with the budget at this point in time. Our grants and revolving funds for '26 are also in good shape. Obviously, we're watching federally what's happening with the funds, but we haven't been impacted at all yet, so we'll keep an eye on that. But we're full steam ahead with the allocations that we've been receiving from the federal government as well as the states. And we're actually in the process already of preparing our fiscal '27 budget, so our individual meetings with schools and departments are underway. One of the things that's actually interesting for us, and I think this is a trend that we're going to see for the next number of years, but our enrollment projections certainly projected enrollment increase, and we are certainly starting to see that a little bit this year. We're actually up 60 students overall, and this is a projection that's going to continue over the next 7 to 10 years. Our overall district enrollment is projected to go up somewhere between conservatively 550 to 700 or so students. So we have 60 new kids in the district this year. We'll produce a report for the school committee at the first meeting in December that actually just shows how that affects our class size and where the kids are distributed through the district. But that's a pretty significant jump for us in 1 year. So just wanted to highlight that for you so you can kind of see where it is. For us, and we've been looking at this, you'll see actually our increase in pre-K population, so that's our CHIPS population, and really at the elementary school level is where we're going to see this start to kind of come through the system. So obviously, we're not going to be talking about this tonight, but when we start talking a little bit about school building projects and things like this, this is the group that would be projected to hit that middle school grade level level when hopefully our school building project would be coming online. So I just wanted to share that with you. And then year to year, we always kind of take a look at our comparables, just to kind of show kind of where we're at, both spending-wise and staffing-wise and performance-wise with districts. Again, for historical perspective, we don't make this up. DESE actually identifies who our top districts are comparability-wise, and this is based on enrollment, grade level configuration of buildings, our special education population, our English language learner population. So they actually identify our top 10 districts. We're waiting to see if there's going to be any updates to this because we are meeting a little bit earlier this year than we traditionally do. So if there are any fluctuations between now and December, I'd certainly let you know. But our 10 districts remained consistent right now from last year. What I did on these slides, so you'll see when it comes to per pupil spending, we are in the bottom third, and you'll see this pretty consistently across the districts when it comes to spending and staffing levels. We're certainly, when it comes to our comps, not spending too much money. We're in the lower third. Only Ashland actually spends a little bit less than us. And on the next slide, what I tried to do, because sometimes we talk about this, these are our kind of Merrimack Valley districts, because people will say, well, where do we fall in with the Merrimack Valley? Even though, obviously Lowell isn't a comp for us because of the size, and one could argue like a Tingsboro might not be, or a Dracut because of the size. In gray, we actually just indicated in district spending. So we're truly not spending too much per child in the district. We have traditionally also taken a look at student-teacher ratios, and the department's doing it a little bit differently this year. Instead of actually looking at individual student-teacher ratios, you would see, previously so many to one. They're actually just looking at the total head count of teachers and dividing it by 100 students to come up with a count. So it was just a little bit different way of doing it. The results honestly don't differ. And on this one, I think it also kind of just tells me we're certainly not overstaffed when it comes to our teaching staff in the district. We're tied with North Andover at the basically the lowest number of staff to students of any of our comparable districts. And a relatively same story when it looks at the other just surrounding districts, the Merrimack Valley. Obviously, we're tied still with North Andover, and Billerica and Dracut have a slightly less teachers per 100 students than we do in Chelmsford. Big takeaway on this one again, we're certainly not over spending, and we're also obviously not overstaffed. Average teacher salary is something we've actually been working on. So this is, all of these slides are FY24 data. We did actually, when we did our last round of negotiations with teachers, recognize that this is an area we're trying to make some advancements with as far as average salaries go. But based on our 24 data, again, we're in the bottom third of spending. So I think if someone objectively looks at this, you'd also say we're not spending too much for teacher in the district. And this also holds true when you're looking at our comparable communities just adjoining in the Merrimack Valley on the next slide. Again, we're in the bottom third of districts with regard to average teacher salaries here as well. Next slide, again, we're in the middle of the pack. So this is, net school spending is the amount of money that districts spend on education that they're required to spend. Obviously, 100% is the minimum target, and then most districts spend in excess of that. So you'll see we're right in the middle of the pack with regard to actual percentage over. So we're at 30% over based on the 24 data. There are 5 districts that spend more, and there are 5 districts that spend less. So we're right in the middle on this spending. Pretty similar also when you add in our Merrimack Valley districts. We're in the middle of the pack with regard to spending over the net school spending amount. And as much as we take a look at, obviously, our staffing and how much we pay for teachers and how many teachers we actually have, and sometimes we are towards the bottom of the bottom third on this, performance-wise, we truly do outperform academically our peers. So even based on our 10 most comparable districts, and again, this is looking at 2024 MCAS data across the board, we were right behind Newton when it came to 10th grade students meeting or exceeding performance on the 10th grade ELA MCAS, which is excellent. When you take a look on the next slide and you actually add in our surrounding towns, the Merrimack Valley, again, this is where Westford kind of jumps in, but we're in the top third of districts on this slide, which I'm very proud of. And the next slide takes a look at our math performance. our math performance on the 2024 MCAS. Again, this is our 10th grade kids. We finished behind Newton and a point behind Andover, but again, in the top third performance-wise in that MCAS math test. And again, certainly in the top third when it comes to even looking at geographically our Merrimack Valley partners. So while we may not spend the most or, pay the most for salaries or have as many staff as some of the other districts do, performance-wise, we're certainly getting a good bang for our buck. And our kids and our teachers really do perform at incredible levels. I thank them for everything that they do to make the schools as positive an experience for our students and families as they do. And this slide just takes a look. This is actually pretty consistent with year over year. So last year, we were also starting out in a level service budget scenario. We're looking at about $2.6 million to just have a level service budget over last year's when it comes to staffing. So you have our COLA increases that were negotiated in our contracts last year. We have our traditional step increases that had previously been negotiated, so you have your steps and lanes factored in. We have some incentives for lane changes. That's for individuals who maybe get an advanced degree. They get a differential for that. And we have some early retirement incentives. I'll have to tell you, we actually have not had a significant number of retirees. Our staff are very stable. I think last year we had 9 out of 475-ish teachers. So we've got a very stable and dedicated staff here in the district. And then we actually have some relatively nominal, in the scheme of things, non-wage related increases for next year. We have transportation contracts for our regular ed and special ed students already in place. Those have small increases in the per day, per bus rates. We're projecting an increase in out-of-district tuition, and these rates are actually set by the state. We don't set these rates. The Operational Services Division for the state sets these rates. So at this point in time, that's the factor that we have in for our current students who are in out-of-district placements. We're increasing, again, a modest increase for utilities. And we had a few smaller contracted services with regard to our building cleaning and whatnot that came in just under $30,000 in total. So all in, about $3.5 million is what's required for a level a level service budget with regard to the Chelmsford Public Schools. So that's our starting point. Thanks, Paul.
Okay, any questions or comments for Dr. Lang? Seeing none, we'll move to our next agenda item, which is the town manager's initial fiscal year 2027 budget discussion, and I'll turn it over to Paul Cullen.
Yeah, thank you, Pat. Good evening, everyone. And first off, I just want to thank you for your time this evening. This is an earlier start than we have ever taken before. And I think it's probably, we're not going to leave here tonight with solutions, but my sense was, in first addressing the select board, is I think we need to get started earlier so that we have more time to consider some things and to weigh some things and ultimately decide some things. Every year we say it, that it's like, how can it be more challenging and how can it be more extraordinary? But let's acknowledge the fact, this is an extraordinary time. We're dealing with a lot of things, and it's always been tough. I mean, we've always known that we're always on that edge. But I mean, you can't help but it goes day to day now. It seems. I mean, look what's happening in Washington today. Or the State House today. Nobody knows what's happening in terms of where things are going. And so we're here tonight trying to talk about a budget that's going to start in 7 months and conclude in 19 months from today, roughly. July 1 of 26 through June 30th of 27, which is why it's called the fiscal year 27 budget. And it's easy to look back and say, gee, you should have known that, could have known that. But I don't know how we can possibly, as was said earlier, we don't know what's going on with federal funding, right? We believe that as of the last 24 hours, that apparently there's a deal to reopen the federal government, and there's some agreements regarding veterans funding and SNAP benefits and agricultural subsidies, but nothing else seems to have been resolved. And it's just an extraordinary time. We also don't know really what's going on at the state level. We open up the newspaper or the tablet or computer, and then we see the governor's offering incentives for people to retire early, but yet no announced plan. It was sort of like, well, because the unions kind of leaked out this idea that you'd get $20,000 if you retired early, and resigned, but yet there was no early retirement incentive to motivate people to actually do that, because given the challenging economic times, you know, how can somebody retire early? What are they going to go to if there's no retirement incentive? Because we know people are doing what they're calling now job hugging, right? Nobody's moving, and they're home hugging as well. Nobody can afford to move out of their current house. And yet, if you went back 18 months ago, you know, it was a labor shortage in terms of, you know, you couldn't get applicants, qualified applicants for positions. So goodness knows where we're going to be. But what we do know is we have to move forward and we have to proceed. And we also know that a year from now, there'll be a biennial election of state officials, including the governor's office, as well as, you know, Congress and so forth. So it's an extraordinary time. Also, what makes this, and tonight, you know, what makes this also challenging is, you know, the town is sort of, you know, still assembling the last pieces of its fiscal year 26 budget, because we just wrapped up a 5-year reval schedule. And I'm going to ask John Souza, our finance director, to just give us a status report, because I know there's a hearing next Monday night in the select board on tax classification and so forth. If John, just want to, just overall, what the assessor's been doing for the last year and where things are in terms of, you know, growth and everything else.
Yeah, so the assessors have been very busy this past year, past few months. They've been doing a total reval of all commercial, industrial, all residential property. They're also required to go out each year and capture all of the new growth that takes place in the community. So that's typically new construction. That could be additions to existing structures, things of that nature. And they've been very, you know, doing a lot of work in that area. And just recently they received, approval from the Mass DOR for the work on new growth. And that's going to come in somewhere around 2.2 million. So, you know, it gives us a good base to work from as we develop the FY27 budget, because we kind of know where the numbers are gonna shake out. And one concern that we see, and again, this isn't so much an assessor function, is when you get beyond, you know, many of you, as you drive around town, you've seen there's a distribution center on Route 129 that's been being constructed all summer long. There's a preschool right here on North Road that's being constructed. You had a large residential multifamily development at 255 Princeton Street that wrapped up this year. But beyond that, we don't see a lot of new developments going on. There may be some smaller things coming. We'll know more as we get into the fiscal year, but just to give everyone a sense of where we are, when you get beyond those projects, we don't see a lot of new development being presented to the Community Development Office.
Thank you, John. So again, we're just wrapping up. And when this report was presented last week, we hadn't had closure on the new growth or the or the final approval of the valuations of property. But towards that, I'm going to put Sam on the spot as our chief assessor, because a week from tonight, he's going to be presenting to the select board. But Sam, just give a sense in terms of where things are in terms of the appreciation of residential values, commercial values, and sort of where things are headed at this point in time.
Okay, well, if we, some of you may remember last year, we were a little surprised at the flatness of the appreciation. We had an overall appreciation of all real property and personal property in town of 1.9%, which we thought was kind of low. But when we checked with our colleagues in adjoining towns, we found that they were finding the same thing. So we felt very sure about that. And then, of course, the DOR certifies the values. So that was right. This year, I have to say, I was a little surprised at the value appreciation that we showed. So we're showing this year about an 8.9% appreciation overall for the entire residential class. That breaks down single-family condos and so forth. So there are different values there, and there are different reasons for why some of those numbers are high. But the thing that really shocked me was the commercial property appreciation, which is showing it at close to 9%. Okay, and again, this is a certification year, and the Department of Revenue takes its time. And as Paul indicated, they came in last Friday and they validated these numbers. So we feel very confident in that. But I think the reason for the anomaly between last year and this year, you have to remember that the market data that we used lags anywhere from 2 to 3 years behind the actual peg date for the fiscal year of '27. So, for example, this past, for this particular period that we'll be talking to the Select Board about on Monday night, the sales evaluation period is from March 2023 through January of 2025, which is extended. The DOR doesn't really like you to go much beyond 16 months, but because of the way the sales either occur or don't occur, you have to grab enough sales to validate the model. In the case of residential, it has to be a minimum of 2%. So, we had that extended period. The farther you get away from the actual date that you're trying to peg to, you could argue that maybe the results are less reliable, but everybody else is in the same boat. As long as we all use the same standard, it's okay. So you have to remember, a year ago, back up 2 years, we were coming off of COVID, okay? Some of that had to do with the lower values and so forth. Since then, we've recovered some, okay? So that could explain some of the difference in the valuations. Going forward, I've been talking to our consultant, appraisal consultant, and they're saying that, pretty much following what the town manager and the treasurer have said, they see flatness going forward. So we're not going to probably see that kind of value appreciation in the out years after this coming fiscal year. We'll see that level off some, reflecting the market uncertainty as you've talked about. So does that answer the
Yeah,
question?
thank you, Sam. It just gives a helpful insight because, again, we'll be stepping into that next week, and it gives a sense, and I'll come back to the valuation and the growth shortly in my presentation. The immediate challenge that's in front of us, and not just us, but, it's kind of part of the reason the federal government shut down is this whole concern over health insurance, premiums, and payments. We are in an extraordinary time of healthcare in this country in terms of cost, and also extraordinary in terms of breakthrough technologies and science and achievements, and that comes in terms of a cost. And what we're seeing now, we came off of last year at an 18.8% increase in premiums, and then we're forecasting at this point, we just received our latest data through September. Our premiums and healthcare costs are matching our premiums, which is not a good sign. You're really supposed to be around 87 to 90% because you've got administrative and other costs. We're funded as, again, a lag of a 24-month cycle because we're funded on our actual costs. So the best information that we have, given the trends, is we're probably looking at a 13% increase in premiums for the upcoming fiscal year. And the budget will actually increase probably about 14% because we also have increase in enrollment and retirees. That's extraordinary, and I'll get into more detail moving forward. And if you want to think of that issue in reality, there's a couple of factors, and I'll get into them later on. But if it's not only happened in human healthcare, but have you ever taken a dog to a vet recently? Today. All right, exactly, and and you're seeing some of the same trends, and I'll touch upon it later. What's going on in that industry? Because that's an industry that's not heavily insured or subsidized, and you just see the cost escalation, as well as the concentration in venture capital investments in what's transforming that industry, and that's it's a reality check. But again, this is part of a systemic problem that really occurred coming out of the pandemic, where we had an extraordinary period of high inflation, which today isn't even at the Fed's guideline of what they hope to be 2%. You've got the Federal Reserve cutting interest rates in 2 successive meetings when inflation is still running 3% or above, because they're now concerned about the recessionary impacts of what's going on. And then you obviously see a disgruntled electorate, as you may have seen by the election a week ago, whatever your political view of that is, it clearly indicates that there's an unsettledness out there. The problem that we have as a community is it's overwhelming our ability to raise revenue to maintain level or essential services. Because unlike the private sector, whether it's your veterinary clinic or your HVAC technician, whatever, we just can't go in and say, oh, well, here's our new rates and our minimum cost. And oh, by the way, we're adding a fuel surcharge and some of the other things that they do to do that. We're constrained by Proposition 2.5, which funds, over 3/4 of our revenue, and that's capped at 2.5%. And so that's the simple story. And we'll talk a little bit later about what we have to do moving forward, regardless of what we decide in the short term. Because unlike the federal government, we can't operate at a deficit. By cities and towns in Massachusetts, and again, I'm speaking not only to the room, but those watching, we're subdivisions of the Commonwealth, and we're bound by state law, and much of what we do is regulated and certified and approved by the state. Sam Chase, our chair of the assessors, spoke earlier. The state certifies our property values. We just don't get to say, well, here's your property values, go do it. We can't issue a real tax bill that gets mailed at the end of next month until the state approves the values, approves the assessor's determination of new growth in the community, approves the select board's tax classification, and then gives us tax rate approval, including our local revenue estimates and so forth, which includes all the certifications that Darlene, our town accountant, submits from the town clerk about what happened at our town meetings. So we can't run at a deficit. We also don't have a revenue base that's sort of less visible to the taxpayer. People complain about the property tax because they see it every quarter and it's a real bill. That's more painful than if you have your withholdings, and therefore your salary goes up, they're still taking your withholdings, you kind of don't see it. And the state also sort of gave themselves a relief valve with this fair share or millionaire's tax, which they're kind of using to supplement some of the Chapter 70 funding we saw and some of the other initiatives like free school lunch and so forth. So the states really, their revenue growth has all been in capital gains and in the fair share tax. If you went back, if they didn't have that, if you went to their baseline revenues, and if you read their reports, they're basically running flat. And that's like sales tax, and so forth. So that's the challenge that we have. And again, this is not new to Chelmsford, but it's now catching up to us because the inflationary aspects. And that's just, when we talk 3%, that's normal inflation. We know there are segments of inflation such as building contractors and others, construction costs that are running much higher, healthcare obviously running higher than inflation. And in fact, the problem is even if you look at what true living index is, which is really not the bundle of goods and services that CPI, but what some economists say this is what the typical resident lives upon, that's running higher than 3%, because that bundle of goods that they use for CPI isn't really a traditional bundle of goods that a regular resident would draw upon. And so why I say that is because the people that we serve are being squeezed as well. Whether it's how much it's going to cost them to have their driveway plowed this winter, or what's it costing them when they go to the supermarket to get a bag of groceries and everything else. And and we see the visible signs of this when we leave the town offices, several nights a week and see the lines at the food pantry, and the attendance at the table of plenty, and other aspects of our lives. What I will point out is, and I put in the presentation, I've cited a few times, the Mass Municipal Association, teamed with Tufts University and did an analysis of the pressures on cities and towns. And I would encourage you to look up this report or read it. I cite it a few times. And they were actually kind of surprised by some of the outcomes, and I'll touch upon that. Because, the summary is the state really hasn't been the full fair partner to cities and towns that we had seen them being historically. So that's going to be a challenge in the future. So again, as Jay noted in his presentation, we've got to be a competitive employer when we're seeking to fill teaching positions or to maintain teaching positions or to attract police officers in what's now more of a free market for police under the recent civil service reforms where you see people moving between communities, or whether we're trying to fill electrician positions, which took us almost a year to hire an in-house electrician in the community and so forth. That's challenging because, again, our contracts aren't settling, nor would they be expected to settle at 2.5%, but yet that's sort of the ceiling on our base property tax. I mentioned again about the health insurance, and then we also are still in the midst of the fully funding of our pension system. We're in the second and final year of a 6.5% in Middlesex County retirement system. We're scheduled to be funded in just over a decade, fully funded. But again, those increases are running at a minimum, they're telling us, of 6.5% into the foreseeable future. And we know when they do the 2-year actuarial, the first year coming out of it is actually above 6.5%. Last year, I think it was 8.8%. And then on top of this, I asked the question earlier about Neshoba Tech in terms of capital. We've got a backlog of capital. I know the school committee is going to be discussing at the next meeting the capital improvement plan for school facilities. Our capital plan committee is meeting this Thursday to kick off discussion. But the bottom line is, as well as we've done, to maintain our buildings, they are aging and they need attention, they need reinvestment. And the most notable one, is the rain's pounding over us this evening in this room, is roofs. And I'll touch upon that greater, but we've got major roof projects. You've seen us go to town meeting on 2 occasions already to fund portions of the McCarthy School roof. And we'll talk about a little later on. You've got Harrington School and most notably the high school coming right up behind it. And then right behind that is fire apparatus for ladder trucks and engines, which are another industry that's just ridiculously exploding in costs, where you've got there's investigations into what's going on of it has gone up so much because, very similar to other industries, a consolidation of providers and then a backlog of time to get these and cost escalations, and again that's being looked at because of the impact it's having on communities where. You may have read, town of Westwood last week went and forwarded the acquisition of 2 pieces of fire apparatus because they know it's going to take them 4 years before they get those fire trucks. And we're trying to maintain, again, the replacement schedule with our fire apparatus. And again, there's only a few providers, and some of us took economics classes. You understand the idea of oligopolies and few market presence, and again, it's indicative, and we see it in the schools on the bus contract. Neshoba and Chelmsford Public Schools go out and bid for a bus contract. There's one bidder, right? And that bidder controls a big segment of the market in terms of regular bus transportation. We see the same thing with trash, right? We go to look for who's going to collect and transport our trash to our either recycling facilities, processing center, or to the trash energy facility in Haverhill. There's basically 3 bidders in the market. And we end up going with the low bidder, and then people say, well, why don't you terminate the contract? And it's like, terminate for what? And you saw that this past summer with the strike. Remember all the trash building up on all the sidewalks? And people say, well, why aren't those cities in town just go find another vendor? Well, 2 things. One is there weren't many other vendors to go to because the capital investment that's required to that in the market. And the second component of that is, again, if you're going to go to that other vendor, the other companies, they wanted that company to win, right? They're not going to, think about it. Rising tide lifts all boats. It's just a very challenging economic period where everything's getting squeezed. So again, coming back to the buildings, the roofs, our other infrastructure, our roadways, bridges, it's just incredible what's needed to take place. I'll touch upon in detail the limited growth of our property tax. John fortunately also sits on the planning board, as does Anita, and they can tell you firsthand better than me, but there aren't lines of new projects that are lining up, not only in Chelmsford, but if you look at it, if you've noticed your trips into Boston lately, you don't see as many cranes in the city. You don't see you're not reading about the projects going through the permitting process. And that's, and that's why you're seeing the state scramble about, oh, well, we got to do something finally about environmental regulations and so forth, because the time it takes to undertake a project and bring it to reality is just so challenging. And then again, I'll touch upon the local aid. So at this point, based upon the preliminary assessment we have, we've got a deficit of somewhere around the neighborhood of $3 million, which on 176 million plus or minus budget for the upcoming fiscal year is only 1.7%. Well, that's not bad. People say, oh, anybody can cut 2% of your budget. Why is that so challenging? But the problem is of that 176 or so, 60 million of that is fixed. In other words, we can't just go in and cut the amount of our benefits and insurance. You can't cut your debt service. We're one of numerous communities in Neshoba. We can't go in there and say, Neshoba, this is what you're going to take. We hope you enjoy that, because that's a regional pool, and we've unfortunately have seen the consequences of some of the other communities who are struggling, basically having to fund it because that's how the system works, and it's the only way it can work. And so when you really factor that stuff out, is now you're talking about $116 million. So when you start taking $3 million of $116 million, that's about 2.6%, much more significant when you're looking at in terms of in the aggregate. Coming back to the benefits and insurance, it's basically our second biggest line item aside from education. And as you can see in the highlighted in yellow, almost 22%, meaning over 1 out of every $5 next year will go to pay benefits and insurance. And meaning benefits being retirement assessment, health insurance, property building, liability, and other insurance for the community. And I like data because it sort of gives what's going on. But as you can see, that number is escalating. Not obviously because you've seen a couple things: the health insurance most recently, and then a couple years back, the property markets were going crazy because of reinsurance, insurance, because of all the category storms that were hitting the U.S. and global, and that's settled down in the last year. And fortunately, I guess we're into November now, but by extraordinary means, the U.S. really didn't suffer a major hurricane. Think about it. We had a couple storms that kind of looked like they were heading to the Carolinas and then took off and so forth. We didn't get what Jamaica just went through. And here in Massachusetts, through our insurance pool, we haven't had any real significant weather-related events, which our biggest damage in our area is windstorms and the impacts of wind and so forth. We're not a coastal community. Really Chelmsford's not a water community. We don't have significant flooding and so forth. So the biggest damages are wind-related, and obviously that's different. You go to the Cape and the islands and some of the coastal communities, but obviously that's the big trend. And you can see that even from 5 years ago, over 4% increase in the relatively in the budget is going towards benefits and insurance. And here it is about the health insurance. Again, look at the last, I think the one that jumps out at me isn't even highlighted. If you go from fiscal 24, we were funding at 4.3 million, to fiscal 27, 3 years, it's increasing by 50%, $7 million for health insurance premiums, for the town's share of those premiums. That's unprecedented, extraordinary, and very, very troubling, because as you can see highlighted in the bottom, if our health insurance premiums had only increased by 7% for this 3-year period, we wouldn't be talking about a deficit this evening. But it's just extraordinary, and the problem is it's not an anomaly. We don't hear anybody coming up with not a magic bullet, but even a off-ramp or solutions to how to manage this. And I'll get into it a little further. What's driving our healthcare costs? Well, overall medical inflation in the Northeast, which isn't very much different than the country as a whole, is over 9%. And this is for hospital services, your diagnostic imaging, your specialty care costs. the labor shortages. You remember the nurses shortages, the traveling nurses, the nurses strike, so forth. Obviously, wages are being pushed up. You've also got the issue of market concentration among health systems, right? Fallon no longer offers in this area. Harvard Pilgrim, Tufts merged. Blue Cross is still standing out there. Your hospitals, right, all kind of, you heard about the Stewart tragedy and what was going on, but you've got these physician networks now that are consolidating. So you've got this sort of triangle of healthcare challenges of the insurers, your Blue Cross, your Harvard Pilgrim, other major insurers, battling with the providers in terms of your Mass General, your Brigham's, your physician networks and so forth. And that's why you sort of read these things you see in the paper about, oh, well, Blue Cross has stated that these people no longer have access to this hospital services. Big one going on right now at UMass Medical Center in Blue Cross. And it's just, the physician, it's all battling. And then you've got the consumer. Let's not forget the consumer. The consumer is demanding, right? They are demanding services because there is assistance that can be reached, but it's costly because you now have specialty drugs and gene therapies that are effective, but they're costly. And as they say on the slide, specialty pharmacy covers over 50% of pharmacy expenditures despite serving 2% of the members. Nobody wants to deny that to anybody, but it's a real cost. And it has to be borne somewhere because, if the federal government is capping it for Medicare, well, these people are going to look for other outlets to bring in revenue, hence the private market, hence the municipal market. The issue of GLP weight loss drugs is to the forefront because it is new and it's expanding dramatically. We see it. Here's the data. You see the data in Chelmsford. In a period of just over 2 years, we've gone from 29 claimants costing $95,000 to 126 claimants totaling $515,000 through September of this calendar year. And the trend is still upward facing. And what we're hearing in the next months is two things. They're going to be coming out in an oral or pill form, probably early next, late winter, early spring, which is going to increase utilization. You have companies in China and pharmaceutical companies acquiring other pharmaceutical companies because this is a growing segment of the market. And to the point where, last week, Trump RX or whatever it is going on, he's basically announcing some deal that the president has cut with for Blue Cross, for Medicare and Medicaid. But yet we don't know the full details. Does that mean that anybody on Medicare or Medicaid can have access to lower prices? And then you see places like Costco selling these drugs for $500 when the health plans were paying $1,200 for the same drug. I mean, it's just rolling. And what we're now hearing is we're not sure what the state's going to do in terms of, what are the options the town has for municipal insurance being self-insured. We could go out to the private market, but they're going to say, well, what's your claims experience? Well, here it is. That's why we're paying what we are. Or you go to the state group insurance commission, and they're dealing with the same struggles where the state had to bail them out because they're running a loss last fiscal year, and then they're running a loss so far through 3 months of this fiscal year. And they're talking about eliminating the weight loss drugs from their program. Or now you're hearing talk about a management plan that if somebody were to take these drugs, then over a 12-month period, there'd be a plan where they would have to make other lifestyle changes. So therefore, hopefully at the end of a 12-month period, they would be off those drugs. But again, the trials and everything are so nascent that we just don't know where that is going to be, but we do know what's happening in reality. When you turn on your TV and you see Serena Williams injecting herself saying, boy, this is a lifestyle. I don't think anybody thought that that's what people were trying to do with the treatment of obesity, that it was going to help Serena Williams. I'm sorry. And then you've just going back to the other drivers, you've got chronic disease, when people are going to the emergency room, the cases are more serious, cardiovascular disease, mental health conditions. And part of it is because of the cost of healthcare, people aren't going until they absolutely have to. And then, as you know, that's more costly. And obviously, we've got an aging demographic and surging mental health and behavioral demand. Coming more into issue of subscribers, our subscriber base is growing. John gathers this data based on the November census of every fiscal year, because that's how we estimate for the upcoming fiscal year. You can see we have just about 1,000 retirees, and we're insuring 689 employees in the community. And you can see those trends are always moving upward into our system. So here's what it means. If at a 13% increase in premiums estimated for the upcoming fiscal year, that premium for an HMO family plan is going to be basically $40,000. And that means the town pays 75% of that, or roughly, roughly $30,000. Right? It's pretty easy. 3/4 of 40 is 30. So it's $30,000. So when you go to add an employee, you're adding a $30,000 cost plus the other costs of benefits to the employee, Medicare and Medicare tax and other components. That's significant. And that's why you're seeing companies going towards AI and these other things. It's because, not only does the AI employee not call in sick or other issues, but, they're not costing them, the extraordinary amounts of benefit costs. Same thing's happening in retiree. Obviously, Medicare supplement plans are less costly, but you can see at a 13% projected increase, that's on a calendar year is when the Medicare runs because they're federal, tied in with federal program. We're looking at a year from now probably being almost over $6,300. And what that means, the town's paying $3,800 for every one of those, people who enroll in our retiree supplement plans. It's costly. Plus, we have retirees that are under the age of 65 that the town is paying 60% of the premium for, who are retired, but we're carrying them as well. Going back to Middlesex that we talked about earlier, the FY27 number is an actual number because they do a 2-year actuarial assessment. So we will be writing a check next July 1st, because as Darlene noted, we pre-fund it. Because the reason if you pay it early, you get a discount of almost $14 million to the retirement system for the upcoming year. And that's an increase you can see of $860,000 or 6.57%. Again, much above 2.5% of the growth in the levy. In terms of employee history, going back, you can see not a lot of movement in the last 5 years on either the town or the school side. 2% increase in 5 years is not material. But obviously, the numbers have grown over the years. So again, if you go back since 2008, which was, prior to the Great Recession, which is sort of a good benchmark, we're up 6.6% on the town side and 16% on the school side. Prior to that was known as the Great Recession. And then you can see on staffing levels, we're pretty flat. Police, you're roughly 70 officers looking back. Fire, you can see it's just static. Obviously you've heard some social media and other media accounts on the staffing levels of the fire department. You can see highway. And why we use highway is the other divisions of aside from facilities of highway are funded through enterprise self-funding funds. So this goes into the tax levy. Pretty much you can see static there. Same thing, facilities we've had to increase just because of the conditions and projects that are going on in the facility level. Library, you can see flat, finance, flat. And the only real increase, as I said, was facilities, and we do count because we're doing full counts. Yes, we added 2 people at the Center for the Arts, because that facility is now opening. Obviously, it wasn't open, our staff prior to that. And then inspections is an area as well. Jay has this in his budget. He talked about it earlier. You saw his teacher data level. So moving on to now debt service, that's not a problem. We're not, as much as we've got a capital backlog, it's not as though we've overextended ourselves with debt and it's crushing our ability to fund programs. Our debt service as a percentage of the operating budget is only 6.2%. However, our non-excluded debt service is 4.6%, which is less than half of the guideline of 10% of general fund revenues. So, you know, that's not an issue, but it is an issue because, you know, it's a component that has to be met. You know, we're going to have to fund $11 million of debt service because it's a legal obligation of the town for the upcoming year. Going back to the non-excluded debt service, as you can see, that number is increasing because we're maintaining our capital improvement plan at 5.8%, which had bumped up over previous year's levels in order to meet the challenges that are before us, which unfortunately almost got legs kind of knocked down because of inflation. So we're really almost treading water in terms of real investment adjusted for inflation in the upcoming year. So we have to, again, accounting for that. And excluded debt, that's namely the fire station debt. Again, that doesn't affect our ability to fund within the levy limit, but it's going to fall upon the tax levy for the two replacement fire stations when that gets added, you know, to that base in the upcoming year. And, you know, the finance director and I are looking at this, we're waiting for the cost estimate and the process moving forward in the bidding process. And most likely we'll do that bonding in the year that the station is open and operational. So that's, you know, that's why you see the number growing most in 28, because we don't foresee that station opening until 28. But we do have, you know, we're sort of borrowing as we need to and doing bond anticipation notes to get there because we obviously have to pay for construction and construction services during the course of that project. As I mentioned earlier about the debt service major projects coming towards us, here are the preliminary numbers that we've just seen as part of the capital plan. And again, as I mentioned, it's roofs. I mean, remember, we just finished kitchens at the schools, high school, Parker, and so forth, and we've done some investments at HVAC at the senior center and so forth. The big thing is roofs. You know, we have a need because we have leaking roofs, just like we addressed the priority at McCarthy's leaking roofs. We do have an area, the kitchen and cafeteria at the high school. The request is to do that in the upcoming fiscal year budget capital plan because that's an area with leaks. But then we know we're going to have to come back for another $8 million a couple years after in 29 because the roof is at the, now, and what we don't know and we're doubtful is, would that qualify for the accelerated repair program that Dr. Pigeon mentioned earlier? Could we get 50%? The problem is if the standards, because the backlog is so severe on those roof and windows and boiler projects, if it's as bad as it continues to be, we wouldn't hit the threshold to qualify because they didn't fund any roofs less than 29 years old in the most recent funding round. And the high school roof is just about 20 plus years. So that's a challenge. So the idea would be, can we delay, extend until we get 50% reimbursement? But again, at some point, it may not become attainable. And then, as you can see, going into 30, you've got the McCarthy School roof. And then in between there, you got the Harrington Elementary School. And there are other roofs that aren't even on here, such as the library, the police station. You know, they just don't have the magnitude of numbers. And then the same thing, as I mentioned earlier, about fire department apparatus. You know, a ladder truck now to replace is $2.7 million. You just can't add a $2.7 million number into a $6 million capital plan and have a viable capital plan. And then behind that, you've got 2 fire engines in 30 and 31 that have to be replaced. So that's the challenge, is how do you fund this? Because this is not a community where you can just go to the ballot and say, oh, just fund this as a debt exclusion or a capital exclusion. We're going to have to find a way. And then, of course, the big thing behind all of this is a new Parker Middle School where less than 18 months from now, there'll be town meeting votes and ballot votes to approve a project that won't hit our debt service till fiscal 31. Because same thing, we're not going to tax the people on the full cost of a new school until they occupy it. So what communities do is you do a bond anticipation note. You basically are carrying your interest costs, and then you permanently finance it, the town's portion, because the state now at least gives you the money up front, the town's portion until the school gets, occupied, which we think will be FY '31. But that's obviously in the back of a lot of people's minds because we need that school project. There are issues of enrollment and learning spaces and so forth that are propelling this forward to the MSBA approval for this project, as well as the ongoing efforts that are taking place with this project. And so again, those votes will be, like I said, late winter or spring of '27. Coming back now to the property tax revenue estimate, removing the excluded debt, because again, that just fluctuates, and it doesn't affect our ability to fund inside. Again, we're finalizing the numbers for '26. You can see it was 2.3 million. It came in at under 2.3, but slightly, it was 2,200,000 and some odd thousand. But the thing I wanted to put up in the slide is that this year's growth number of 2.3, okay, or just under 2.3, was a full reval year. And what that means is when the town's out there doing the 5-year required examination of properties in the community, in that fifth year period, that's when you capture more stuff because you're out looking at more stuff. So with that being a reval year, and with the two of the buildings at the 255 Princeton Street, the former UMass West campus, having been occupied by the June 30th cutoff, all that resulted in was $2.3 million of new growth. The final building, which is going to be occupied in the next few weeks, and final part of that project, we're factoring that into the '27, which is the budget that we're preparing for. We're using $1.9 million. So that means all that revenue growth from that, which will be the highest assessed property in this community at probably over $80 million, is already baked in to these numbers. And what it turns out, when you looked at the data over those 2 years of new growth and value, it's about a $750,000 increase to the property tax levy, which was below the $1 million estimate that was thrown about when the project was brought to the community for approval. But that's just the reality. Part of the issue, that's just the reality. And remember, I'm not getting editorialized here, that's based on it's, even though we consider it a commercial project, it's considered residential construction. And as you know, as a community, we have a residential tax split of 17% where we give a discount. So that also discounted our new growth because that was considered to be residential. I'm not editorializing, I'm just informing you in terms of what happens out there. So that's, in other words, and as was stated earlier by John and talked about, we don't see anything major in the pipeline. You're going to get a child care facility on North Road. The condos are finished up, next to the library there at the corner at 9 Acton Road. And there's some minor projects that are before the planning board for a contractor's yard, and someone's talking about another daycare and so forth. Even that new building that was built, as we talked about at the intersection of Alpha Road and Billerica Road, the thing with the, it now looks a little more attractive, as the siding's going on. But the value of that building as a warehouse facility use is actually less than what it would be replaced because office has a higher value for valuation than a storage building. And it kind of makes sense, right? Think about what's your values of property. That's sort of why the city of Boston is hemorrhaging so bad is they've lost a lot of their grade A office space because of vacancies and so forth. But the bottom line is, it's sometimes when you see what's out there, it's really challenging into what's coming at us. So, again, I don't being a harbinger of gloom, but I'm just trying to be the reality of what's confronting us. The issue of the average single-family tax bill. Again, the select board will decide tax classification approximately December 1st. As I said, the hearing is next Monday. They'll wait 2 weeks to get input from the community. They'll schedule the vote December 1st, and then the job of the assessors and finance director and working with the accountant, everything is to get those bills out by the end of December And what that's going to mean is the average tax bill in Chelmsford will exceed $9,000 for this upcoming, for this fiscal year that we're in right now. I think, again, not to get into the next week's hearing, but right now, if they maintain the split at 17%, it's 4.5%. 4% is the increase in the average single-family bill. Again, that's 4%, right? So they sit there and say, what's going on? The town can only raise its revenue 2.5%, but their bills are going up 4%. It's because of the shifting values. And again, it's just a challenge there for us as a community. State revenue, again, when state revenue is just two things. It's Chapter 70 school aid and it's unrestricted general government aid. As you can see, the Chapter 70 school aid is roughly $15.5 million. Our unrestricted general government aid is $6.3 million. Everything else is just, miscellaneous in that. Looking a little more at the Chapter 70, we got an adjustment in fiscal year '24 of 18% of 2.179. As you can see, now it's gone down to more, measurable levels. This past year that we're in now, 26, we got a 5.24%. That was $150 per student, and that got us resulted in an increase of $770,000 for the upcoming year. Sometimes you look at data and it sometimes surprises you. I looked at, well, wait a minute, what's your Chapter 70 now versus historically? And as you can see, it's actually up slightly. Chapter 70 funds about 20% of our school department operating budget. Now, again, the schools operate at more than what the town's appropriation is, but based on the value of the town appropriation versus Chapter 70, we went from 20 years ago to 16 2/3 up to over 20% in terms of Chapter 70 funding. But if you look at, and this comes from this report that the Mass Municipal Association and Tufts put out, Chapter 70 educational aid, you can see it's predominantly being driven to the gateway cities. That's what this chart shows you, over time. And, we're sort of in that suburban group. And the ones that are really suffering are out in Western Mass and the rural areas. They've really been taking it hard because they didn't have the enrollment. The system was based on enrollment, which is why we kept having these issues with the town of Westford, how they were getting more Chapter 70 aid during the period when they were getting increased enrollment, yet when their enrollment went down, there's no correction. But yet Chelmsford was already at that level. It didn't happen. Here's Chapter 70 aid per student, and again, it just shows you the annual change in Chapter 70 per child. You can just see how the urban and gateway priorities have just sort of been allocated the funding compared to suburban and rural communities. Why this is important is this upcoming fiscal year, it'll be the last year of funding under the 7-year funding schedule of the Student Opportunities Act. The state legislature has begun hearings to determine how they're going to allocate Chapter 70 education aid in subsequent fiscal years. And this is going to be a struggle because everybody needs more, especially in a period of uncertain federal funding. But as we know, that's really where the discussion has to take place is how is this education funding going to be allocated in the future and what proportional share will come in a period right now where the state's struggling because we no longer have the MCAS as sort of the regulator of performance. And so now the question is going to be, how do litigants, because that's how the education reform has historically been changed over years, go back to '93 and so forth, it was because of litigation that somebody in a community said, my child isn't being fairly funded for education, much like a child in this community, usually a wealthier community. And that's what led to the reform back in '93. And what leads to what really is an uncertain future going forward is how does the legislature allocate education aid, because every child in the state's deemed to have an appropriate and equal educational opportunity. That's going to be a big factor. And so the problem is that's not going to help us for '27. That'll probably be determined for '28. And given that 26 is an election year, we don't know when those determinations will be made, but it's going to be real challenging because, the election will be in November, and then the governor's budget we do in January, and because of a transition legislature, it's going to be real interesting to see when and how that gets allocated. Here's the other thing that was interesting from that study by Tufts and the MMA is the state share of local revenue by state. And you can see the gold bar in the middle is the US average. And Vermont is the far left, that big green thing. And I know Vermont's not a typical state. But you can see Massachusetts is that red line. So the point of the analysis was, and the other green lines are the New England states. So the analysis was is that Massachusetts, believe it or not, was less than the US average and really towards the lower quartile of revenue sharing from the state to, towards local government, which I think just shocked a lot of people because that's not the image that we have of Massachusetts in terms of partnership with cities and towns. But yet we did see that with unrestricted general government aid, and that was one of the key parts of this funding. This year's increase was 1.1%, $68,000. And more importantly, this chart, this is the unrestricted general government aid for all municipalities from the year 2002 to 2024. And if you adjust it for inflation with that red line that's called 2002 base, you can see how the state is underperforming by, 20+%, depending upon what type of community you are, gateway city, suburban, and so forth. So that's the issue, is the partnership and the revenue sharing that if you went back to Mike Dukakis and going back, way back, that's how the cities and towns survived Proposition 2.5 in the 80s, was by state revenue sharing. And then you see that's waned, and yes, you expect to see the dips during the recessionary periods, but even in the recovery periods, and even in a period where we had the fair share tax, they still funded it at 1.1%. And so even when you hear things like, our Chapter 90, Chapter 90 funding for roads, and, they just funded a 50% increase from 200 million to 300 million. Yeah, but they don't tell you the rest of the story that, for 12 years, they did nothing. So the purchasing power of the 300 million today is less than the 200 million a dozen years ago. That's the story. And why I mention is that's beyond this room, but these are the messages I think that have to be delivered to the governor and the legislature. And obviously in a period where they're getting squeezed because they're looking for the federal government, which is now turning off the spigot to them. So the best we can have at this point is somewhere we'll probably get about $900,000 of additional state aid. And that's being the optimist that, believe it or not, I am an optimist. Because I don't want to live any life any other way. But I'm assuming that we'll get $150 per pupil funding for the upcoming fiscal year, the upcoming years. And I base that on a couple things. One is it's optimism, but two is it is an election year. And historically, the legislature is a little more tuned to Chapter 70 and state aid in election cycles as into those years. Because again, those votes are taken in July and August, and they're going to the ballot in primary in September and an election in November. But again, being an optimist there, saying we can get another $150 per pupil funding, that would get us about $900,000. Going back to the local receipts more locally, I want to show you the fluctuation here because, again, this goes back to the idea that we're forecasting out 7 months and 19 months. Motor vehicle excise, as Darlene noted, we're okay right now, but we won't see the big commitment until January. What's driven that has been the inflationary impacts of the price of new cars, right? The motor vehicle excise is based on your manufacturer's suggested retail price. It has nothing to do with the price of used cars. So the fact that used cars have gone ridiculously in pricing doesn't give us more motor vehicle excise tax because it has nothing to do with the value of your vehicle. It has to do with the manufacturer's suggested retail price of the year of manufacture, and then it goes down by a depreciated schedule. It goes 90 the year of manufacture to 60 to down to 25. So that's been driven by inflation because, and I think it's helped because most people were leasing vehicles, so they're turning over their leases. As long as they're renewing the leases, you're getting that inflationary aspect. So that's been strong. But licensing and permits, as John noted earlier, there is no extraordinary licensing period. So obviously, this past year, our revenues went down by a third. That's because in '24 was the permit for 255 Princeton Street, which is over $1 million. And the other thing with investment income, Darlene noted, gee, that's going to decline. Why? Because the Fed's cutting rates. And we have to mark to market on our investments. Meaning we have to carry on our books what the value of those assets are, if they're in treasury bills or other secured securities. So obviously, as the Fed declines rates, you're not going to earn the interest level if they cut rates by 1% and so forth. And that's why you saw in actual '22, how can the number be negative? How could you have negative investment income fiscal year '22? It's because John had to mark those values to their market, and that was the issue with the bond prices were declining. So you can see the fluctuation, and that's why we expect that that's going to decrease. The other thing with rooms excise, the state is paying for the room occupancy for the sheltering at the Best Western site on Chelmsford Street. We are told by CTI that that is going to end next summer, which means next fiscal year. So those people are going to be relocated, we understand, to a facility in Lowell, but that means the room excise is going with them. And yes, the new hotel where the former Radisson was is going to open. But we clearly are anticipating a decline in room excise because it's not as though we have a shortage of rooms in Chelmsford. We have the Element, we have the Holiday Inn Express, and now we'll have the Home to Suites, I think the Hilton brand at the former Radisson site. Again, none of those are luxury. In fact, what you saw happen in Westford, if you're not aware of this, the Regency is closing next month.
Yeah.
And it's not because, there's a surplus of quality hotels. It's because there's more money to be made converting that site to housing and tearing it all down than it is to run a hotel. And that's what's going to happen. Westford did their MBTA zoning, and they've got a project on Powers Road, and they've got a project at the Regency. So that's going to shut down, and Westford's accounting for their loss of room excise in that facility. And so that's reality, and that's what's going to impact us in the upcoming year. So again, we don't see any bump in permits and licenses, and we're going to see declines we expect in room excise and investment income. So again, we're looking somewhere around 850,000 in preliminary revenue estimates, and then available funds, which is this other category that you see. And there's really not a lot there. As you can see, the dollar amount's kind of decline, but that's really because the funding for the sewer project is declining as well. So there's really no, magic there. The sewer project debt service for the latter stage of that project came from sewer betterments, the capital improvement fund, and the sewer construction stabilization fund. So that's why it's declining. Really what this is benefit costs, or we call offsets, from those enterprise funds that they provide. The town provides benefits, health insurance and such, that they reimburse the cost of the town for that service. Again, I've beaten on inflation. As you can see, we don't have official statistics out yet through November, because we're in November, but even through September, the data is still murky because of the government shutdown, but everything we're seeing is still above 3%. And again, we never recaptured from that 2022, 7.1%. And there's no indication that something is going to fall through in inflation in the upcoming years. So I added this slide because not for nothing, but more, I wanted to remind people that John talked about this at fall town meeting. So I said, I'm going to put John's slide in. I'm going to note in bold that this was John's slide at fall town meeting. And what John was trying to explain was there's a structural imbalance. If you look at our preliminary estimates of new revenues and you looked at 3 major fixed cost increases, we're already in deficit, not including, other town departments. And as we said, the deficit's around 3 million, and this only shows you about 708,000 of that for the year. So this is my final slide in terms of the whole purpose of tonight is where do we go from here? And why did you pull us out in November and something you could have told us in December? And the reason is we need the time, I think, to go back and assess and evaluate and compare and figure out what we're going to do, because I didn't want to come in December and say, well, geez, Paul, the budget's due in 2 months. We don't have enough time to react or contemplate or implement. A couple of them are longer term. As I said, the advocacy for additional state aid, Chapter 70, unrestricted general government aid, and the unlikely, but the request to increase local option meals taxes and room excise taxes. It's very clear. This legislative leadership is not supporting local revenue enhancements either at the state level or at the local level by local option. And these are going into the dustbin of history, it appears. But that doesn't mean the requests aren't valid. And next month, you will hear a request from the Mass Municipal Association of, can we, here's our bundle of how we're going to, help cities and towns. And it will include local option meals and rooms taxes. And I think it's worthy, of discussion, but it's not going to help us in '27. And again, it's not clear when or if or ever it will be implemented. Again, it's a small amount. The state applies over 6% for the meals tax, and the town is about 0.5%. And then they allowed us some room excise. But I think the other thing that's not talked about and even mentioned on there is would they modify Proposition 2.5 to adjust it by inflation as opposed to to 2.5%, and that's like touching the third rail. Apparently. And you have the same results. It doesn't seem to be any traction towards this because it's an unpopular tax because it's so visible, and it's a growing tax. People's properties are appreciating. You've got people, regardless of your income levels, who are paying higher property tax. And unlike other parts of the country, they don't allow local option income tax or other solutions. And so that's, but that's the conundrum. And that's why, again, the need to the state saying, hey, look, you've got to be partners here. You can't acknowledge a special ed, but acknowledge a special ed cost, special ed transportation costs, benefits, and so forth are rapidly outpacing inflation. And these are big cost drivers. What are you doing for us? But it's real. So the other thing is you then start looking internally to the town, and then you start getting into the distasteful options, implementing license and user fee increases. The big one that we saw in Drake this past year, and we saw Lowell do, was a trash fee. I mean, all that is an end around Proposition 2.5 because you don't need the voter approval, and they don't get to write it off in their taxes. But you basically say, oh, by the way, here's your bill to collect your trash and recycling. And I'm working with our public works director. We'll calculate that. Because our job is to put everything out there on the table so at least people can say, did you look at it and are you considering it? Pay-as-you-throw is even more challenging. We know Westford is looking at pay-as-you-throw. That's a hard one to go backwards on, because you're now basically saying, well, you had 2 barrels, but now it's bags that you got to buy these special color bags. And yeah, you can put them in a barrel, but they're going to be monitored by the camera and you can only throw out what's in the, it does work. But it's not popular, and it is a reduction in service. We're kind of running into that even on the bulk item thing, where we're getting pushback from the trash and facility. They don't want us delivering bulk loads of furniture for safety considerations. So that's an issue of user fees, licensing. The schools don't like user fees either. I was in this room when they voted the bus transportation fee well over a decade ago, and I was here when they implemented the unsightly and just gut-wrenching issue of charging kids user fees to participate in extracurricular activities and to park your car at school and all the other things. But it wasn't because those school committees were insensitive or intolerant. It was they were faced with 2 choices, bad and worse. And, so that's something in the mix as well. The other thing is, do you reduce your services? For example, Chelmsford is one of the few communities that collects trash at condos. That's always been a sensitive issue. We eliminated it several years ago for apartments, but then the question is, do we join our fellow communities and say, no, if you've got a multifamily of 4 or more condos, i.e. Williamsburg, and others, then, you're on your own. Not popular, but it's something, my job is to put out there on the table what could be done. And then the select board and others decide what can be done and will be done. And town meeting ultimately decides what will be done. And then the other thing is looking at is regional services. I've been working with Chief Spence about, what would the financial benefit be in the long term if we were to join the regional public safety dispatch in Tewksbury, that Tewksbury and Drake could now share. It's been looked at in the past by the town. The select board in the past have turned that down. The problem, as Drake is realizing, is it only gives you a 3-year benefit, and then your costs go back up to the full cost of the service, which is what Drake is now encountering because it's at the 3-year window. And they're starting to question, well, did we really save anything, and so forth. And they'll do their own analysis. But the other thing I've asked the chief to look at is, well, what if we were to provide regional dispatch to a neighboring community? What would there be? And so we actually have a meeting scheduled with the state overseer of the program to see, well, what would there be financial benefits? Because you want a win-win for all communities. And we do some sharing, like we share animal control and other services. And obviously we share regional planning with Northern Middlesex. And clearly the best example is our regional vocational school district. So we're looking at that as well. But at the end of the day, somewhere we're going to have to wrestle around $3 million. And that's really the end point is, by law, we have to present a balanced budget. We don't have a settled labor contract with the firefighters this upcoming year. We're in a mediation process, so that'll have to be back funded for 2 fiscal years, meaning the upcoming year and then the year that we're in right now. And so we have a placeholder. We can't pre-fund it, but we got to be mindful of the fact that that bill eventually is going to have to be paid because there will be a settlement at some point on that contract. You saw the police number earlier in the number, so that's going to be there. So the end result is, I think it's fair to say that at this point, everything's on the table. I don't have at this point a vision, and it needn't be my vision. It has to be our vision of how we move forward in the short term as well as medium term to address this challenge. And I thank you for listening for what was a long discussion, but I just want to stop here and answer any questions that you may have. And again, hopefully, we're due to come back here in 4 weeks. And it may not end in 4 weeks, but it will end at the end of January, beginning of February, because it has to. As Dr. Pigeon noted, Westford is going to town meeting the end of March, so the Neshoba budget will be out in early February. My discussions, I saw the Westford manager this morning. Westford is not seeking an override this year. Tewksbury kind of feels that this is sort of their last year that they can get by for the upcoming year. Drake is at a different place, as we know. The city of Lowell, they're behind, their schedule goes later because they're a city, but obviously they must be worrying what's going to happen with a lot of the federal funding that goes to the city and state aid, because state aid makes up such a larger portion of their budget. So that's sort of where we're at this point in time. And as I said, where we go is the capital process, I said, will begin on Thursday. I expect that when we reconvene in December, we should have the semblance of that plan, but I think we know what the funding level has to be. We talked about almost level funding that for the upcoming year. And then again, we're going to look at anything. And if anybody has a suggestion who's either watching this meeting or at this table, either tonight or in the weeks ahead, please let us know. You saw the historic numbers of staffing. It's not as though we've become bloated. And you saw the staffing numbers that Dr. Lang gave in terms of teachers. We know what some of those costs are. Many of those are fixed costs, to be fair to the schools. Their biggest increases have been in special education and support services for students, because we've seen that growth of IEPs and the growth of behavioral and other support services. that aren't discretionary. And so that's what makes this also challenging. So I will stop there.
Questions or comments for the town manager?
For our December meeting, will you have dollar amounts for some of these?
Yes, yes, yeah, we will try to put some dollar amounts on some of the trash options. And I'm hoping to have some preliminary on the public safety dispatch, and others that, yeah, the goal would be is how can we do something with that? Yeah, yes, the short answer is yes. We're going to try to quantify that, as well as, the select board asked us to look at fee schedules. We do that annually now. We may come back and do another review and say, hey, despite that as we reported to the board, the town's fee levels for licensing and so forth are at where our comparable communities are. We may just have to say, hey, look, given the realities, we may have to bump them up. But yes, that would be our goal, is to come back with some more specific numbers and options when we reconvene. But the purpose of tonight was to get the thinking and the information out there so that these thoughts and considerations can take place in the weeks ahead.
And you mentioned that other towns for the condos, if you could have, if we have the numbers and just have how many other towns are doing it, that would be really
Yeah.
helpful for our next meeting. And then I just have one more question.
Sure.
On the health insurance, on the GLP funding, have you heard anything about, theoretically, right, this is helping people lose weight, which should help with, the reason why insurances are paying for it is because if people are healthy weight, then they don't have cardiovascular, they don't have diabetes, which would help in the long term. Have you heard anything about, have you heard anything, I guess, are they forecasting any savings in the long term? Are we gonna start seeing this in 10 years, or?
I was at a meeting in August with one of the executives at Blue Cross Blue Shield. Their answer was they have no empirical evidence that these weight loss drugs result in longer-term savings. Now, again, part of the problem is they're so new that you don't have the data. And yet I was at a meeting last Friday with one of the providers of these management programs who said, oh, our trial shows that people save. So part of it is you got to say, are you getting unbiased data? But the other part is, it's too short of a window, but think about it, and again, we're not sure what the federal government's going to do with Medicare and Medicaid, despite the announcement last week, but what Blue Cross is saying is they're no longer providing it because they don't see the data, and they're in the health business. Right? But what they're saying is, what you larger employers, you can decide whether to offer it, and then here's the premium you'll pay to provide that level. But the short answer is no. But you're right. The intuitive thing would be, well, gee, if somebody is healthier, then you're going to have future claims and down the road. But right now, there's no evidence that anybody has brought forward that's credible that shows that. It may just be that there isn't enough time period to do that in terms of these drugs have only been around in the last few years. And that I think the concern is that what they do see is that when people stop taking them, because they have side effects, it's not just the reason some people stop taking them is they have side effects, gastrointestinal and other side effects. And then when people go off them, then the weight comes back, because what it's doing is it's suppressing the urge to eat.
Yeah.
So it's not, and people aren't doing other healthier changes in lifestyle, then that's where it falls apart. So the short answer to your question is no, I haven't seen any evidence, because if it were, then the companies would be saying, hey, look, take this cost now, but you're going to see these trends coming down in the years ahead in terms of cardiovascular, kidney, and other diseases. That's not what you're seeing, and these are major providers in a very progressive state, right? Where Massachusetts, right, there isn't a place with more progressive healthcare and quality of healthcare, and yet your providers, your Blue Cross, your Harvard Pilgrims, and so forth, they're talking about doing away with it.
Well, can I ask a side question?
Sure.
I see the costs that it is to the town. It's just growing every year. So Blue Cross Blue Shield Medicare Advantage that the town offers to retirees has announced starting January, they will not cover these GLP at all for any weight loss. Do you know if any of the other town plans are also saying the same thing, like, will that cost go away because they will not?
The federal plans, the Medicare supplement plans, and they're on a calendar year. So that's why you're seeing these announcements come
Yeah.
in January. The town's health plans are on a fiscal year, so they're not out till July 1.
Not the Medicare Advantage, because I looked.
No, Medicare Medicare Advantage is a Medicare supplement plan.
Yeah.
That's on a calendar year. So that's why they're saying is here's your renewal, and therefore we're not covering it as of January 1. Decisions have not been made onto the July 1 active employee renewals. That decision will be made in the next, it'll probably be made in the next several weeks for the town, for our active plans, and for the GIC, it will be made by March. What the GIC wanted to do, the GIC, which is the Group Insurance Commission, speaking in acronyms, which insures state employees as well as the towns that participate in the state's program, they wanted to do a mid-year change of plan and cut them off on January 1. The legislature did nothing with it. And so that's not going to take effect. And again, this late entry into the race is this idea of this managed plans would, well, you can provide it, well, but you're going to have to enroll and participate in this management plan for lifestyle changes if you're going to continue on this. We don't know how that's going to unfold, and we also don't know how that program would work, because if you don't, are you off it forever, or is it only in that cycle, or what? So that, the short answer is we don't know.
And what we also know is even though the insurance company may save money by no longer covering those drugs, they are still increasing premiums.
Yeah. Oh, yeah,
So the
because that's
cost
not,
does not
because
help
it's
the
not just the
town.
GLP. Yeah, we shouldn't just say that if we could just wipe out the GLP drugs, that GLP-1 drugs, that everything is fine.
Because the premiums are still. going
Premium, yeah, and a lot of it, they mentioned earlier, is specialty pharmacy. And gene therapy, some of the fantastic cancer drugs and everything else, but those are expensive. And then the trials that work and the trials that don't work, I mean, it's like anything else. We have such great technology and such great research in a state that's really built upon pharmaceutical and medical innovation and leadership, that's sort of what's driving it, but it's costly. And it's no different than what you're seeing environmentally, right? Look at all the money because we can now detect PFAS in parts per trillion and forever chemicals, it's now costing for a fortune, to remediate and address those issues. And we know that firsthand as a town because we've got one active remediation site, and then we're cleaning up soils and groundwater from underground fuel storage tanks that were removed with permits and environmental review, 20 years ago for fire stations, and now we're back saying, oh, test the water for PFAS. Oh, it's costing us tens of thousands of dollars. It's because we've become so technologically savvy that therefore that the research and the equipment that comes out of that is great. And, who knows, where it's going to go. But the bottom line is no one's been able to wrestle the cost component of that. And that's really the challenge is, we can do remarkable things that were unheard of generations ago. And I know probably all of us have been touched by that, either personally or through family or other members, that if this technology that exists today didn't exist, and it did not exist, 20 or whatever years ago, those people didn't survive. Now you've got remarkable, and again, it's just the nation. And I say the nation because it's not unique to Chelmsford, it's not unique to Massachusetts. The nation just hasn't come to grips with this in terms of how do we provide this, and how do we fund this, and how do we allocate it? Because, as noted, it's a health condition. Obesity, just like mental illness and other things, it's a health condition for GLP-1, but other drugs. And therefore, how do we wrestle with that in terms of funding it? I don't know. But what we do know is the concentration of providers becomes the wrestling match over funding. And that's not just limited in healthcare. We see that everywhere else, right? We no longer have an Enterprise Bank in Chelmsford. It wasn't because Enterprise Bank was going insolvent. It's because the market changed. But what is that going to mean in the long run? You know, I think, as I said earlier, we saw those things and have seen those things with school bus transportation, fire apparatus, solid waste, and so forth. It's, you know, it's a game, we're in a venture capital game. And we're sort of bearing those costs of what the world is in 2025, which is not the world of 2000 or what have you.
So just one other request here is if we could also look in context of the 5-year outlook, because I think sometimes we might have ideas that are good and maybe applicable for the next year, but then we lose sight of the ripple effect over the course of the next 5 years. And so based on the presentation, we have a compounding sort of effect of deficits that are coming up that are projected. So I think that might be helpful to put in next meeting in the context of as we make these decisions, what does that mean for the future?
Yeah, and that's why John provides per our bylaw a 5-year forecast at fall town meeting, and he showed that this was a $3 million problem compounding annually in that 5-year period. The challenge is, who would have thought 2 years ago that who'd be sitting in the White House today, or what the Congress would be, and to now say who's going to be sitting in the White House in 2031, or even 2029 it's groping in the dark when we don't even know what's going to happen in 5 weeks or 5 months, never mind 5 years. And so that's why we tend to spend less on the long term, because this is such an unpredictable market. And I think that's part of what's slowing down the economy is the investment is stopping because there's no certainty. The rule was always government was supposed to provide a stable environment so that investments could make healthy investments. And now what you're seeing is that's all been turned upside down. You have, whether you believed in things like putting wind turbines or whatever on the ocean, there were contracts let, there was work performed, and all of a sudden it just got ripped away. And these other things, and again, I'm not trying to get into the political aspects of it, but one can't but acknowledge the volatility. Look at the regulatory environment, the same thing, right? You've got the state, a very progressive state of Massachusetts, basically saying within the last month, we're going to remove all these hurdles for environmental things, so that we can build more housing and so forth, because we know to do a simple stream crossing, it's 5 times the cost because of the environmental licensing and permitting review. And Pat and I heard this morning as we were with Representative Arciero, that a simple stream crossing, because of the regulatory review, it's just getting to the point where it's just not a viable investment, and that's why you're seeing companies hold back from investing because of the uncertainty, and that's the worst thing that can happen in our climate, because nobody even knows what tax policy is, never mind environmental or other regulatory policy, because of the volatility.
Any other comments or questions for the town manager? Seeing none, I'd open up the meeting for any general discussion if anybody had anything to say. Okay, seeing none, we'll take a motion to adjourn.
Make a motion to adjourn.
Can I get a second?
Second.
All in favor? Aye. Opposed? Thank you all.
All right, thank you.